Biographia Literaria, Chapter 14 is what we have to go through by Samuel Coleridge. Now, the written monuments of most of Coleridge's critical theory work, criticism, is contained in the 24 chapters of Biographia Literaria, published somewhere around 1815 to 17. Now, in this critical discussion, Coleridge concerns himself not only with the practice of criticism but also about its theory. Now, in his theoretical approach to literature, we get a glimpse of Coleridge as a poet and also as a philosopher. Now, as a poet, he discusses about the theory of literature, and as a philosopher, he talks about the difference between poetry and a poem. So as a poet, he discusses the main differences between poetry and prose. And as a philosopher, he discusses the difference between poetry and a poem. Now, why is he important? Because he was the first English writer to insist that every work of art is by its very nature an organic whole. So, this is the first step in ruling out the assumption that the classical writers told the readers, that the object of poetry is to instruct and to make men morally better. Now, Coleridge was one of the first English writers to rule out this assumption and bring forth the view that every art of literature is an organic whole and it exists for itself. Now, in Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, Chapter 14, Coleridge talks about two important points of poetry. One, the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature. And two, the power of giving the interest of novelty by modifying with the colors of imagination. So, according to him, poetry was a correct combination of the truth of nature and imagination. Now, according to him, it was decided that Wordsworth would write poetry dealing with the theme of nature, and he would deal with the theme of imagination. The first type of poetry that he mentions is the treatment and subject matter should be, I quote Coleridge, the sudden charm which accidents of light and shade, which moonlight or sunset, diffused over a known and familiar landscape, appear to represent the practicability of combining both. So, the first type of poetry is a kind of poetry in which the subject matter is like a sudden charm. It's like an accident that happens between the moonlight and the sunset, wherein it represents the practical elements of both real life and that of imagination or fancy. In such poems, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life. Characters and incidents were to be such as it will be found everywhere, in every village or in every vicinity. The second type of poetry is where the incidents and agents were completely supernatural. I quote Coleridge, the excellence aimed at was to consist the interesting affections which actually deals with or affects the dramatic truth of emotions as would naturally accompany with such situations. So, Coleridge believes that the second type of poetry would be a perfect blend of imagination and natural will, wherein imagination would have an upper hand over reality, and thus the reader will comprehend the poetry with a willing suspension of disbelief by keeping aside your intellect for some time and completely being immersed in imagination. So these are the two types of poetries Coleridge talks about. One in which there's a perfect blend of reality and imagination. Two, a type of poetry in which imagination takes the upper hand over reality. Next, in the chapter, he talks about the distinction between prose and a poem. Now, he says that a poem contains the same elements as a prose composition. The difference lies in those elements and objects aimed at creating a certain type of ambience in both the compositions. If the object of the poet may simply be to facilitate the memory, to recollect facts, he would make use of certain artificial arrangement of words with the help of meter. So according to Coleridge, the difference between a prose and a poem was the combination of the words. So as a result, composition of a poem could easily be distinguished from the composition of a prose by the meter and rhyme involved in the arrangement of words. So an example he says is 30 words had September, April, June and November. Here if you see, a specific rhyme and meter is being used. Thus, the arrangement of words when it is accompanied with meter and rhyme creates a special effect which distinguishes a poem from prose. Thus, according to Coleridge, the mere super addition of a meter or rhyme does not make a poem. So he also reminds the reader that just by adding meter and rhyme to the combination of words does not create a poem. He says that, according to him, various prose writings and its immediate purpose and ultimate end would not be in simply arranging the words. In scientific and historical composition, the immediate purpose is to convey truth. In prose works of other kind, it can be to give pleasure or it can be to give truth. Thus, the communication of pleasure may be the immediate object of a work which may not be metrically composed. So it's not just the arrangement of words, it's not just the superaddition of meter, but it's a perfect blend of meter, arrangement of words, of whether the writing prose or poem conveys truth or pleasure or both. So now the question is, would then the mere superaddition of meter with or without rhyme entitle the name of a poem to a piece of writing? To this, Coleridge replies that if meter is superadded, the other part of the composition must also be in harmony with it. So this is also important for a piece of work to be called as a poem. Each part of the composition, including meter, rhyme, diction, theme, etc., must remain in harmony with the wholeness of the composition, which means if the poem is divided into many parts, each part should be in unity with each other, and when all parts are combined together, again it should portray the same unity. So he says this is a basic difference between a poem and a prose. And of course, meter is superadded. Thus, according to Coleridge, the poem is distinguished from prose compositions by the immediate object of prose, which is to give truth, whereas that of poem is to please. He again distinguishes both these, poem and prose, by saying that he calls a poem a legitimate poem because it must be one the part of which mutually supports and explains each other. And of course, it will be a pleasurable activity of mind, excited by the attraction of the journey itself. So he says that these are the conditions that create a difference between a poem and a prose. A prose puts forth truth, a poem is basically to please. A prose need not have meter or rhyme, but a poem should have meter or rhyme, and each part should be in unity to the whole. And of course, the arrangement of words in poem is completely different from that in prose. So thus, why is this important to us? Because it is in this chapter that Coleridge puts an end to the age-old controversy of whether the basic aim of a poem is to instruct or delight. Right from Plato, Aristotle, Horace, Longinus, they all talked about poem being a medium of both instruction and delight. Coleridge was one of the first writers to say that the only aim of a poem is to delight, is to give pleasure to the reader. Next, in chapter 14, he brings about the importance of imagination and fancy, and he says this is why the second type of poetry is quite important. Now, he writes that the imagination he considers has two types, primary and secondary. Primary imagination is a living power and prime agent of all human perception. It's a repetition of the infinite mind, or the eternal act of creation. So primary imagination is not voluntary, it's involuntary. Everyone has primary imagination. Every living being has a primary imagination, according to Coleridge. The secondary imagination is an echo of the primary imagination, coexisting with the conscious will. Now this only true artists and true poets get this talent of a conscious will with primary imagination, which creates secondary imagination. So the secondary imagination dissolves, diffuses, dissipates reality. Why? In order to recreate and to make reality seem more acceptable, more attractive to the readers. Fancy, on the other hand, has no other counters to play. It is fixed and defined. So fancy is indeed it's a mode of memory, emancipated, freed from the order of time and space. It's completely the creative capacity of an artist, wherein time and space are not given much importance. Imagination, on the other hand, is a power first put in action by will and understanding and retained, which is understood and retained by memory. Now, as he says, there is primary imagination and secondary imagination. Primary imagination is the power of perceiving the object of sense, both in their parts and as a whole. It's an involuntary act of mind, as I said before. The human mind receives impressions and sensations from the outside world unconsciously and involuntary. It's not under our control. It imposes some sort of order on these impressions and reduces them to a particular size, shape, and category, so that the mind is able to form a clear image of the outside world. It is in this way that clear and coherent understanding becomes possible. So every living being has a primary imagination. Secondary imagination, on the other hand, is the artistic creation. Everyone does not have this. It is more active and conscious. It's an effort of will. It works upon the perceived of what is perceived by the primary imagination. So the raw material of secondary imagination is of course what you see using your primary imagination. The impressions and sensations are taken through primary imagination, and then it is being processed by secondary imagination by using the artist's creativity. So the external world dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to create. Thus, the secondary imagination is at the root of all poetic activity. And it is this power that Coleridge calls as magical or synthetic power. So according to him, secondary imagination is very important for an artist, for a poet. Thus, he says that imagination, fancy, good sense, everything is important for a poetic genius. He says that good sense is the body of a poetic genius. Good sense is your primary imagination. Fancy is its drapery. Drapery in the sense the poetic genius is clothed or draped beautifully using fancy. Motion, its life, of how much movement of thought is there in the work, and imagination is the soul. So only when you have a perfect blend of sense, fancy, motion, and imagination that you get a graceful, intelligent whole. A great work is then produced. So all this is important according to Coleridge. Now, he also talks about comparison with his own views and Wordsworth's views, because both of them initially together discussed and agreed to write the lyrical ballads and of course Biographia, Literaria. Now Coleridge owed his interest in the study of imagination to Wordsworth. Wordsworth was interested in the practice of poetry and considered only the impact of imagination on poetry. Now this is where Coleridge differs. He is the first critic to study the nature of imagination and examine its role in creative activity. Secondly, Wordsworth uses fancy, imagination as synonyms. They're almost the same. Coleridge is the first critic to differentiate between fancy and imagination. Fancy is a process wherein time and space are not giving importance at all, whereas primary and secondary imagination, again, one is conscious and the other is unconscious. So Coleridge's treatment of the subject is characterized by deeper depth, penetration, and philosophical subtlety according to some critics. So that is why Coleridge is important to listen. Thus we can conclude that to establish the principles of writing rather than to furnish rules about how to pass judgment, this is exactly what Coleridge does in Biographia, Literaria. He is one of the first English critics to base his literary criticism on philosophical principles. But while critics before him had actually turned poems inside out by talking about its demerits and merits, Coleridge gave importance to the basic question of how it came to be a poem, or what is the basic function of poetry. He was much more interested in the creative process rather than the finished product. So this is why Coleridge is important to a student of literature because apart from all the other writers and critics, Coleridge gave a lot of importance to imagination and fancy, which according to him was a drapery of the composition that you are going to present before the reader. So he stressed on the importance of creativity rather than the finished product as a whole.